Retired cowboy lived alone for years until 5 Apache widows changed his life forever. Wild West story. The sun rose slowly over the dusty horizon, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. In the small cabin at the edge of the prairie, James Walker stirred awake. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he stood and walked to the window. Outside, the land stretched endlessly, dry grass bending in the morning wind, the distant mountains casting long shadows over the valley. It was quiet, too quiet for a man who had once lived among the hustle of ranches, cattle drives, and the laughter of friends and family. James had lived alone for years, ever since the world had taken away the people he loved. His wife had passed away a long time ago, leaving a hole in his heart that nothing had been able to fill. Their children had grown, leaving the small town behind, seeking their fortunes in cities far to the east. Occasionally he would receive a letter or a brief visit, but those moments were rare, and they only reminded him of how empty the house felt when they left. He had once been a strong, capable cowboy. He knew the land, the cattle, and the ways of the Wild West like the back of his hand. He had ridden through storms, faced dangerous animals, and even seen men fight over honor and property. Those days had been full of purpose and adventure, yet they had also been exhausting and lonely in their own ways. Now, at 68, James spent his time tending to his small garden, repairing fences, and keeping the few animals he had. Life had slowed, and he had grown used to the silence. Each day, he followed a quiet routine. He rose with the sun, fetched water from the well, and walked among the small crops he had planted. He smiled at the tomatoes beginning to ripen and nodded at the squash creeping along the ground. He could almost hear his wife's voice telling him to be patient with the plants, just as she had been patient with him. For a moment he allowed himself to remember her laugh, her gentle hands, and the way she had managed the house with calm efficiency. The memories were bittersweet. They brought both warmth and sadness, reminding him of a life that once felt full. After breakfast, which was usually simple, some eggs, bread, and coffee, James would step outside to inspect the fences. The ranch was small now, just a few acres he had kept from the larger property he once owned. Cattle were a rarity these days, mostly just a couple of cows he kept for milk. The land had changed too. The nearby town had grown, though slowly. New settlers had arrived over the years, some making friends, others bringing tension and competition. James had always preferred solitude, so he stayed on the edge, quietly tending to his land and leaving others to their business. The neighbors were few, and most were younger men and women with families. Some would wave when they passed, tipping their hats in the old-fashioned way that reminded James of the days when he had ridden into town on horseback after a long cattle drive. But he rarely spoke to them beyond a polite greeting. Conversations often felt awkward, and he had grown to enjoy his own company more than anyone else's. Evenings were the hardest. The sun would dip behind the hills, casting long shadows over the prairie, and the wind would whistle softly through the trees. James would sit on the porch with his old guitar, strumming a few chords. He had once sung at the town gatherings, lifting his voice with pride, but now the songs were just for him. Sometimes he imagined his wife sitting beside him, nodding to the music, smiling at the familiar tunes. At other times he imagined his children running across the yard, laughing and calling his name. The silence that followed these thoughts made the nights feel colder. Despite the loneliness, James found solace in small things. He enjoyed watching the wildlife, deer grazing at the edge of the forest, rabbits hopping across the dry grass, and hawks circling in the distance. He marveled at how life continued without pause, even as human lives could change so quickly. The land reminded him that time moved forward, whether he liked it or not, and that there was a rhythm to life that could not be ignored. Some days he would ride his horse along the trails he had known since youth. The horse, a sturdy brown mare named Daisy, had been with him for nearly a decade. She carried him across the prairie with a steady gait, ears twitching at the slightest sound, eyes alert. Riding gave him a sense of freedom, a connection to the past when he had been stronger and the world had seemed full of possibilities. He could feel the wind on his face, smell the dry earth, and remember the long rides with friends who were now gone. James also spent time repairing old structures on the property. The barn had seen better days, and he patched the roof, fixed broken beams and oiled hinges. He took pride in his work, knowing that his hands, though worn, could still build and mend. Each repaired nail and beam felt like a small victory over time itself, a way to leave a mark on the world that might outlast him. But life was not without its difficulties. Supplies were sometimes hard to come by, and the town's general store did not always have what he needed. Winters were harsh, and storms could be unforgiving, isolating him for days. He had learned to be self-sufficient, to rely on himself for food, water, and safety. Over the years he had grown tough, capable of handling whatever the land threw at him. Yet, despite all his skills, he could not repair the emptiness in his heart. One afternoon, as he worked in the garden, James noticed a group of children playing near the edge of the forest. Their laughter carried across the fields, bright and lively, unlike anything he heard in his cabin. He smiled quietly, hidden behind the rows of corn, and watched them for a moment. It reminded him of his own children at that age, their small hands reaching for the sky, their eyes full of curiosity and wonder. A pang of longing struck him, and he felt the familiar ache of loneliness more keenly than ever. At night, James would light the old lantern in his cabin and read from a small collection of books he had gathered over the years. Western stories, histories of the frontier, and journals of explorers filled his shelves. He read them not just for entertainment, but for company, as though the words themselves could keep him connected to a larger world. Sometimes he would jot down thoughts in a worn notebook, recording memories, reflections, and lessons learned. These notes were never meant for anyone else, but they gave him a sense of purpose, a feeling that his experiences might one day mean something. Life continued like this day after day, quiet and predictable. James had grown used to the rhythm of his existence, the rising sun, the chores, the solitude, the memories, and the quiet reflection at night. He had accepted his life as it was, believing that it would always be this way, that he was destined to live and die alone, a relic of a bygone era. But as James tended his garden one morning, a flicker of movement at the edge of the horizon caught his eye. He squinted against the bright sun, unsure if he had imagined it. A group of figures appeared slowly, walking across the dry fields. They were women, and their pace suggested both wariness and determination. James watched them cautiously, curiosity stirring in his chest. He had not seen strangers pass this way in years. For the first time in a long while, something outside his routine stirred his interest. Who were these people? Where were they going? Why had they come to this quiet, isolated place? James felt a strange mix of apprehension and anticipation, as though the arrival of strangers might break the long spell of silence that had wrapped around his life. He turned back to his cabin, but the image of the approaching figures lingered in his mind. Something was about to change, though he did not yet know what. The prairie, which had always seemed vast and empty, suddenly felt alive with possibilities. And for the first time in years, James Walker felt a spark of hope that life, even in its later years, could bring surprises, connections, and new beginnings. James Walker had not slept well the night before. The thought of the figures he had seen on the horizon lingered in his mind. He could not stop thinking about who they were, where they were going, and why they had chosen this part of the prairie. For years his life had been predictable, almost unchanging, and now the unknown stirred a mix of curiosity and unease. Early in the morning, as the first rays of sunlight painted the land with a warm glow, James mounted Daisy, his loyal horse, and rode toward the area where he had seen the figures. The dry grass crunched under the horse's hooves, and the wind carried a faint scent of smoke. As he drew closer, he could see them more clearly. They were 5 women walking slowly but steadily across the prairie. Their clothing was simple and worn, the kind that had seen long journeys and hard days. They carried small bundles and looked tired, yet their posture showed a quiet strength. James slowed his horse, keeping a distance. He watched as they reached a small hollow near the edge of a distant stream. The women paused, looking around, as though trying to figure out where they were and what safety might exist nearby. James could not help but notice that they were not alone. Several small children clung to the women's skirts or walked alongside them. Their faces were serious, but there was a spark of resilience in their eyes. He stayed hidden behind a clump of bushes, observing. He had encountered strangers in his youth, often in dangerous situations, but these women and children did not seem threatening. They seemed more in need of protection than capable of harm. For a moment, James felt a tug in his chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years, a sense that someone else's survival depended on him. After some time, James returned to his cabin. He could not sleep while wondering what would happen to the women and children. He made a quick breakfast and packed a small bag with food, water, and a few blankets. He did not know if they would accept help, but something inside him urged him to try. He saddled Daisy and rode toward the hollow again, moving slowly so as not to startle them. As he approached, one of the women noticed him. She was the eldest, with hair streaked with gray and eyes that seemed to have seen too much hardship. She raised a hand in greeting, wary but polite. James nodded and spoke softly, introducing himself as a local rancher. He offered food and water, explaining that there was a safe place nearby where they could rest. The woman studied him carefully, then glanced at her companions. After a brief discussion, she nodded and led the group toward James's cabin. The journey was slow. The children walked beside the horses, some holding hands, others carrying small belongings. James made sure to walk alongside them, keeping an eye on their safety. He noticed that the women spoke quietly among themselves, sometimes pointing to the land or checking the sky. He did not understand their language fully, but he sensed a deep bond between them, a shared history that bound them together in a way that he could not imagine. When they arrived at the cabin, James led them inside. His small home had enough space for temporary shelter, though it was not large. He prepared the rooms as best he could, offering blankets and warm water. The children clung to the women, some curious but shy. James noticed that they were polite, careful not to touch anything unnecessarily, yet their eyes shone with curiosity and wonder. Over the next few days, the women and children began to settle in. James provided food and helped repair the small firewood stove. He watched as the women worked together, preparing meals, cleaning, and caring for the children. Their movements were careful but efficient, showing experience in managing hardship. James found himself both impressed and humbled by their resilience. He learned that the women had come from Apache communities nearby, their homes destroyed by flooding and land disputes. Each woman had lost a husband in different ways, some to illness, others to accidents or violence. They had banded together for survival, traveling long distances to find safety and a place to rebuild their lives. Their courage struck James deeply. He had faced many challenges in his life, but the determination of these women reminded him that strength often came from necessity and love for those they cared about. James began to help in small ways. He repaired fences, fetched water, and helped gather firewood. He showed the women how to tend small livestock, manage crops, and protect their temporary camp. In return, the women shared knowledge he had never known. They taught him how to use herbs for minor injuries and illnesses, how to identify edible plants, and small tricks of survival he had not considered. Though they came from different backgrounds, their skills complemented his, and he felt a growing sense of community that he had not experienced in decades. The children were the first to break through his reserve. One small boy, no more than 7, followed James everywhere, asking questions about the land, the animals, and even Daisy. James smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that he had not known for years. He found himself laughing at the boy's curiosity and answering questions he had not thought about in decades. The other children soon joined, their energy filling the cabin with life and movement. As days passed, James realized how much he had missed companionship. The women were cautious, but they were not cold. They shared stories of their lives, of hardships endured, and moments of joy. Their children laughed, played, and cried in ways that reminded James of his own family long ago. He felt a responsibility for them, a protective instinct that surprised him. For the first time in years, he felt needed, and that need brought a sense of purpose he had thought lost. The townspeople noticed the new arrivals as well. Some were skeptical, wary of outsiders, especially native women and children. Others were curious, wondering why James had taken them in. At first, there were whispers and sideways glances, but James did not care. He knew that what mattered was the safety and well-being of those who had trusted him. Slowly, the townspeople began to accept the group, seeing the women's quiet strength and the children's innocence. James and the women faced challenges together. One afternoon, a heavy rainstorm flooded parts of the small valley. James worked alongside the women, reinforcing the cabin's walls, moving supplies to higher ground, and keeping the children safe. The storm was fierce, but the shared effort brought a sense of solidarity. James realized that even in the harshest conditions, humans could survive when they worked together. Nighttime brought quiet moments of reflection. James would sit on the porch, watching the stars stretch across the sky, while the women and children settled inside the cabin. He thought about his life before they arrived, the long years of solitude, and the sense of emptiness that had filled his days. Now, with the women and children around, life was unpredictable, lively, and demanding, but it was also meaningful. He understood that purpose was not just in survival, but in connection, in helping others rebuild their lives. James also noticed subtle changes in himself. He felt less lonely, more patient, and more open to learning. He found himself listening intently to the women, trying to understand their customs, their ways of seeing the world, and the wisdom they carried. He admired their strength, their courage, and the love they showed their children. He realized that life had more to offer even in his later years than he had imagined. As weeks passed, routines developed. James and the women shared daily chores, meals, and stories. He learned the names of each woman, the histories of their families, and the small joys they found even in hardship. The children learned to ride horses, help with feeding animals, and explore the land safely under James' watchful eye. The cabin, once silent and lonely, now rang with laughter, conversation, and the sounds of life. For James, the transformation was profound. He had thought his life would end quietly, surrounded only by memories. But the arrival of the 5 Apache widows and their children had given him something he never expected: family again. Not the family he had lost, but a new one, built on trust, kindness, and shared effort. He realized that life had a way of surprising even those who had given up hope. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting golden light over the cabin, James looked around at the small group. The women were preparing dinner, the children played nearby, and Daisy grazed calmly at the edge of the field. A feeling of contentment filled him. He understood that his life, once quiet and solitary, had begun to change in ways he had never imagined. The loneliness that had weighed so heavily for decades was lifting, replaced by the warmth of connection, the satisfaction of helping, and the promise of new beginnings. James knew the road ahead would not be easy. The women and children had challenges, and he had responsibilities he could not ignore. But for the first time in years, he felt ready. He felt strong, hopeful, and alive, and he knew that together they could face whatever hardships the prairie, the town, or the future might bring. The days passed, and life at James Walker's cabin slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. The 5 widows and their children were no longer strangers. They had become a part of the land, as natural as the prairie grass that swayed in the wind. James observed them closely, learning their habits, their strengths, and even their quiet moments of sorrow. In turn, they watched him, noting his kindness, his patience, and the way he moved about the land with a calm, steady confidence. James noticed small changes in himself. He was more patient than he had been in years. He no longer dreaded the days or the silence. Instead, he woke up with a sense of purpose, ready to help wherever he could. He still tended his garden and repaired fences, but now he did so alongside others, teaching them what he knew and learning from them in return. Even Daisy seemed happier, following the children as they ran about the fields, occasionally tossing a playful nuzzle toward James. The widows began to teach James small lessons about their culture and ways of life. He learned how to find certain plants that could be used for medicine, how to prepare food in ways he had never tried, and even how to use subtle hand signals to communicate quietly over a distance. At first he struggled, often fumbling or misunderstanding, but the women were patient. They laughed softly at his mistakes, guiding him gently without shame. James found himself enjoying these lessons, feeling more connected to the world than he had in decades. One morning, while checking the fences, James noticed one of the younger widows, a woman named Ayana, struggling to carry a heavy bucket of water from the stream. Without a word, he dismounted and took one of the buckets. She gave him a small, grateful smile, and he felt a warmth in his chest that went beyond simple kindness. The act was small, but it symbolized the growing bond between them. They were learning to trust each other, to share burdens, and to rely on one another in ways they had not before. The children became an integral part of this new life. They were eager to learn, their curiosity boundless. James taught them how to ride horses, guiding their small hands on the reins and showing them how to feel the rhythm of the animal beneath them. He watched with pride as they learned quickly, their confidence growing with each passing day. He also showed them how to care for the animals, how to feed them, groom them, and respect them as living beings. The children's laughter and excitement brought a light into the cabin that had been missing for far too long. Evenings were a special time. The women and James would gather around the fire, sharing stories from their past. Sometimes the widows spoke of the lives they had lost, the husbands and families who had once been with them, and the struggles they had faced along the way. Other times they shared tales of hope, of traditions, and of small joys they had found even in hard times. James listened intently, offering words of encouragement and empathy. He shared stories of his own life, tales of his youth, of cattle drives, and of adventures that seemed almost unbelievable now. Through these stories, a sense of mutual respect and understanding grew. Life was not without its challenges. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west. Dark clouds covered the sky, and the wind howled across the prairie. The women and children worked quickly to secure their shelter, while James helped reinforce the cabin and moved supplies to higher ground. The storm raged for hours, rain pouring down in sheets, lightning cracking across the sky. Yet, through the chaos, there was cooperation and courage. Together they endured the storm, and when the clouds finally parted, the cabin and the camp had survived largely intact. The shared experience strengthened their bond, proving that they could rely on one another in times of adversity. During quieter days, James taught the women practical skills related to ranch life. They learned how to mend fences, tend to livestock, and even handle small repairs around the cabin. At first they struggled with the tools and techniques, but James was patient, demonstrating each step with care. He found joy in their progress, in their determination to learn and adapt. It reminded him of the value of passing on knowledge, of guiding others not for recognition, but for the simple satisfaction of helping someone grow. The widows, in return, taught James to see life differently. They showed him the value of patience in ways he had never considered, of understanding the rhythms of nature, and respecting the strength in gentleness. They shared techniques for preserving food, making clothing, and managing small household tasks efficiently. James realized that despite their hardships, these women possessed remarkable wisdom, and he felt honored to learn from them. One afternoon, a small problem arose that tested the growing trust between them. A young boy had wandered too far into the woods while exploring. James and the women panicked at first, fearing the dangers of the prairie, wild animals, uneven terrain, and the vast emptiness that could easily hide someone. They searched together, calling out his name, hearts pounding. After what felt like hours, they found him near a stream, safe but scared. Relief flooded through them all, and James felt a protective warmth stronger than anything he had known in years. The incident reminded him that this new life came with responsibilities, but also profound rewards. As weeks turned into months, the group began to think about the future. The cabin had been sufficient for temporary shelter, but it was small and lacked space for everyone to live comfortably. James proposed expanding it, adding rooms and reinforcing the structure. The women enthusiastically helped, bringing their own skills to the project. Some worked on building walls, others on preparing meals and organizing the space. The children helped where they could, carrying small tools or fetching materials. Each day brought tangible progress and with it a sense of accomplishment and pride. James also realized that he was beginning to form emotional bonds he had thought impossible. He cared deeply for the women and children, not as a replacement for his lost family, but as a new connection built on trust, respect, and shared experience. He found himself laughing more often, smiling at the children's jokes, and feeling satisfaction in seeing their growth and happiness. Life, which had once felt empty and predictable, now felt vibrant and meaningful. The town began to notice the changes as well. Some neighbors, initially skeptical of the newcomers, saw the progress being made at James's cabin. They observed the women working alongside him, the children playing happily, and the sense of order and purpose that filled the once quiet property. Slowly, attitudes shifted. People began to greet the group with respect, recognizing their hard work and determination. James found himself not only part of a small community at his cabin, but gradually becoming reintegrated into the larger town's life. The arrival of spring brought new energy to the land. The garden flourished, crops grew steadily, and animals thrived. The women celebrated small victories with laughter and joy, from the first ripe tomato to a successfully mended fence. James felt a pride he had not experienced in years, a reminder that life's beauty could still surprise him. The bond between him and the widows deepened, built not only on necessity but on genuine care and shared achievement. One evening, James walked along the edge of the prairie, reflecting on the journey so far. He thought about the years of solitude, the moments of longing for connection, and the unexpected arrival of these women and children. He realized that life had a way of offering second chances when least expected. The loneliness that had once defined him was fading, replaced by purpose, friendship, and a sense of belonging. As the sun set, casting golden light over the land, James returned to the cabin, greeted by the sounds of children playing and women chatting. He watched them for a moment, a deep sense of gratitude filling his heart. He understood that life would continue to bring challenges, but he also knew that together they could face anything. The widows had not only found shelter and safety but had transformed his world in ways he could not have imagined. For James, this was a turning point. The quiet years of isolation were over. In their place came laughter, shared effort, learning, and connection. He had discovered that life, even in later years, could offer new beginnings, unexpected bonds, and profound joy. The widows and their children had brought life back into his home, and he had offered them protection, guidance, and companionship. Together they were building something stronger than any of them could have done alone. A family, not defined by blood, but by love, trust, and shared purpose. And so as night fell over the prairie, James Walker sat on his porch, listening to the wind and the soft laughter of children, feeling a sense of peace and hope that had been missing for decades. For the first time in years, he believed that life was not only about survival, but about connection, growth, and the beauty of unexpected friendships. The days ahead would bring more work, challenges, and lessons, but James knew he was ready. And he was not alone anymore. Spring had settled fully over the prairie, and with it came a sense of new life and energy. James Walker had grown accustomed to the constant activity at his cabin. The 5 widows and their children were no longer strangers or guests. They were part of the rhythm of daily life. The once quiet, solitary cabin was now full of laughter, chatter, and the small sounds of work being done together. James often paused to watch them, feeling a warmth in his chest that he had thought lost forever. Each day brought new tasks and responsibilities, but also small joys. The widows had begun to organize their living spaces more efficiently, turning rooms into shared areas for work, play, and rest. The children learned to help with chores without being asked, carrying water, feeding animals, and sweeping the floors. James marveled at how quickly they adapted to the routines, their spirits bright despite the hardships they had endured. He felt a quiet pride in seeing them grow confident and capable. The widows themselves had begun to speak more openly with James. They shared memories of their lives before disaster had forced them to leave their homes, stories of love and loss, of families they had once had, and the resilience that had carried them through difficult times. James listened with respect, sometimes offering advice, sometimes just hearing them out. These conversations helped him understand their world and reminded him of the strength it took to survive when everything seemed lost. James also noticed changes in himself. He was no longer content with merely surviving, tending a garden, or repairing fences. He found himself thinking about the future, what could be built, what could grow, and how he could help these women and children thrive. He began planning expansions to the cabin, envisioning more rooms, safer living areas, and a place where everyone could feel secure and comfortable. It was a different kind of work than ranching or cattle drives, but it was meaningful in its own way. One morning, James gathered the widows and children outside. "I think it's time we make this place stronger," he said. "The cabin is safe, but we can make it better. Bigger rooms, more space for the children, a place to store food for winter." The women exchanged glances, some smiling, others thoughtful. They nodded in agreement. Together, they began to plan, each contributing ideas based on their skills and knowledge. Some suggested ways to make rooms more comfortable, others recommended storage solutions, or ways to strengthen the walls. The work began in earnest. James supervised construction and repairs, showing the women and children how to lift beams safely, secure nails, and manage tools. At first, the work was slow, and mistakes were made, but no one complained. They laughed when things went wrong, encouraged one another, and celebrated small successes. Even the children had tasks appropriate to their size, sweeping floors, fetching wood, or handing tools to the adults. Each day, the cabin began to take shape, becoming more than just a place to stay. It became a home. While the work progressed, James and the widows also focused on cultivating the land. The garden grew larger, with rows of vegetables carefully planted and tended. James taught the widows how to rotate crops, preserve seeds, and manage pests without harming the plants. They shared knowledge from their own traditions, introducing techniques for watering efficiently and storing produce for winter. Together, they transformed the small plot of land into a thriving source of food and pride. The children played and learned in between chores, running through the fields, climbing small hills, and exploring the nearby woods. James often followed them on horseback, keeping a watchful eye but allowing them freedom to learn and grow. The children's laughter became a constant in the cabin, a reminder that life could be joyful even after hardship. The widows encouraged creativity as well, teaching the children songs, storytelling, and simple crafts. The cabin became a place of learning as much as survival, filled with both work and play. One evening after a long day of work, James and the widow sat around a small fire outside the cabin. The children had gone to bed tired but happy. The women spoke of their hopes for the future, safety for their children, a permanent home, and a community where they could belong. James shared his own thoughts, admitting that he had never imagined this kind of life in his later years. "I thought I would spend my days alone," he said. "But now I see that family can come in many forms, and life can still surprise you." The women nodded, understanding without needing many words. As summer approached, the group faced small challenges that tested their teamwork. One day, a section of fence near the edge of the property collapsed during a heavy rainstorm. The widows and children worked alongside James to rebuild it, learning how to reinforce posts, use tools correctly, and protect the livestock. By the end of the day, they had repaired the fence, stronger and more secure than before. The shared effort not only strengthened the cabin, but also the bonds between them. Each member of the group realized that they were part of something bigger than themselves. James also began to notice the subtler changes in his heart. He felt a sense of belonging he had not known for decades. He laughed more freely, worried less about solitude, and felt proud of the women and children who had become part of his life. He realized that connection, trust, and shared effort brought a kind of joy that was different from adventure or achievement. It was deeper, steady, and comforting. The town, too, began to notice the transformation. Neighbors who had been wary of outsiders saw the progress being made at James's cabin. They watched the women working tirelessly, the children thriving, and James guiding the entire operation with calm patience. Slowly, respect replaced suspicion. Some neighbors offered small gifts, advice, or assistance, acknowledging the family that had taken root at the edge of the prairie. James was glad to see the town beginning to accept them, but he knew the real change had already happened at home. One afternoon as they worked in the garden, a young widow named Nayeli spoke softly to James. "We are grateful," she said. "You have given us safety and a place to belong. You have shown us that life can be good again." James felt a lump in his throat. He had never been thanked for anything like this before. His life had been filled with work and solitude, but this acknowledgement touched him deeply. It reminded him that the connections they were forming were mutual. that each of them depended on the other not just for survival, but for emotional strength. The children thrived under this nurturing environment. They learned responsibility through chores and curiosity through exploration. They learned respect from the widows and James, and they learned confidence as they faced small challenges, climbing hills, helping with livestock, or navigating the fields safely. Their growth became a source of pride for the entire household. James realized that this was perhaps the most important work of all, raising a new generation with love, guidance, and resilience. Evenings remained a time of reflection. James often sat on the porch, gazing at the sunset with the widows nearby, sharing stories and laughter. The children sometimes joined, sitting quietly as the older members spoke of life, hope, and lessons learned. These moments were quiet but profound, grounding James in the knowledge that life, even after loss and loneliness, could offer new beginnings. One day, while walking along the property line, James noticed a small group of neighboring ranchers approaching. Initially, he felt a flash of anxiety. He had learned that not everyone in town welcomed change or outsiders. But as they drew closer, he realized they came with friendly faces. They offered tips for fencing, advice on crops, and even promised small assistance in case of emergencies. James smiled, realizing that the acceptance of the town had begun. It was not universal, but it was a step toward a more connected, supportive community. James also began to notice the emotional growth of the widows. They had endured so much hardship, yet they displayed remarkable resilience and adaptability. They laughed more easily, smiled with confidence, and took pride in their accomplishments. Their children thrived in this environment of safety and learning. Together, the household had grown into a supportive unit, each person contributing to the well-being of the others. As summer drew to a close, James looked around the cabin and the land surrounding it. The garden was flourishing, the fences were secure, and the children were happy and healthy. The widows had found not just shelter, but a sense of purpose, belonging, and hope. James realized that life had come full circle. From years of solitude and reflection, he had found connection, community, and even love. Not romantic love, but the deep bond of family. And he had found cowincing. One evening, after a day of work in the fields, James stood on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The children laughed in the distance, playing a game taught by one of the widows. The women were busy inside preparing the evening meal, occasionally glancing out and smiling at him. James felt a sense of fulfillment unlike any he had known. The hardships of his past, the loneliness and the quiet years had prepared him for this moment. He understood that life, even late in years, could surprise him, offer joy, and teach him new lessons about strength, patience, and love. In those quiet moments on the porch, James Walker realized that the future, once uncertain and empty, now held promise. With the widows and their children by his side, he was no longer alone. Together they had built not just a home, but a family. They had transformed a solitary life into one filled with laughter, work, learning, and hope. And for James, this was proof that life, no matter how lonely it seemed, could always offer a chance to begin again. The seasons changed once again, and the prairie around James Walker's cabin blossomed under the warm sun of late summer. The garden had grown lush and full, the crops thriving, and the small livestock James kept were healthy and strong. The cabin, which had once been a simple structure, now stood proudly as a home, expanded and reinforced with the help of the widows and the children. Windows shone in the sunlight, and the smell of fresh bread and cooking filled the air. The once quiet and lonely place had become a lively and thriving household. James often paused on the porch, watching the children run through the fields. Their laughter echoed across the prairie, light and carefree, a sound he had almost forgotten existed. He felt a deep sense of peace and pride. This life, which had once seemed impossible so late in his years, had taken shape in ways he could not have imagined. The widows, too, were busy but content. Their movements were confident and steady as they worked together, preparing meals, tending the garden, and teaching the children skills they would carry into the future. Life had not always been easy. There had been storms, floods, and challenges along the way, but each difficulty had been met with courage and cooperation. James had taught the women about the land, the animals, and practical survival skills, while they had shared their knowledge, culture, and ways of caring for each other. The combination of their skills had transformed the cabin from a simple shelter into a strong, safe, and nurturing home. One morning, James rose before the sun. The children were still asleep, and the wind carried a gentle chill across the fields. He walked to the edge of the prairie and looked out at the land. He thought of his years of solitude, the long stretches of quiet when the only sounds had been the wind and Daisy's hooves. He remembered the loneliness, the ache for family and connection, and he smiled softly. None of that was gone entirely, but it had been replaced by something far greater: purpose, companionship, and love that came in unexpected forms. The widows had grown stronger too, both in body and spirit. They worked alongside James without complaint, lifting heavy beams, planting crops, and teaching the children. Their resilience was remarkable. Each had endured hardship, yet they faced each day with courage and determination. James admired them not only for what they could do with their hands, but for the warmth and care they offered to everyone in the household. They had rebuilt not only their own lives, but his as well. The children had grown more confident, exploring the fields and learning practical skills. James took particular pride in seeing them care for the animals, feed the garden, and even attempt small repairs around the cabin. He encouraged them to ask questions and to be curious, and they responded eagerly, soaking up knowledge like little sponges. Their growth was a daily reminder that life was still full of possibilities, even for those who had once believed they were too old, too tired, or too lonely to find joy again. One afternoon, James and one of the widows, a woman named Elise, walked along the edge of the prairie. They were checking the fencing and making plans for expanding the garden. Elise spoke softly, telling James how grateful she was for his kindness and patience.
"You gave us more than shelter," she said. "You gave us hope."
"You gave the children a future. You gave me a place where I belong." James felt a lump in his throat. He had never expected words like these, and yet they filled him with a warmth and humility that went beyond anything he had felt in years. The community that had once been wary of outsiders began to notice the change as well. Neighbors who had previously looked at the group with suspicion now offered help, shared advice, and even stopped by with small gifts of food or tools. James smiled as he realized that their household had become an example for others, a demonstration of what could be achieved when people worked together, trusted one another, and shared in both labor and life. Evenings were often the most joyful part of the day. The children would sit around the fire listening to stories from the widows or from James himself. They learned about the land, about animals, and about the ways of life that had sustained people for generations. The women told tales of resilience, courage, and cleverness, while James shared stories of his youth, of cattle drives, and of adventures that had once seemed impossible. Laughter, learning, and love filled the cabin, a sharp contrast to the silence that had once dominated James's life. As autumn approached, James reflected on the transformation that had occurred. What had begun as a small act of kindness, offering shelter to strangers in need, had blossomed into something far greater. The widows had found security. The children had found a home. And James had found family, connection, and purpose. His life, which he had once thought was ending quietly in solitude, had been filled with meaning once more. The household faced challenges as always, but now they approached them together. One day a wild storm threatened the crops. The women and James worked tirelessly, protecting the garden, reinforcing the fencing, and ensuring the animals were safe. The children helped where they could, learning the value of preparation and cooperation. When the storm passed, their efforts had succeeded, and the cabin, garden, and livestock were intact. They celebrated together, aware that their combined strength had made them resilient. James also began to notice subtler changes within himself. He laughed more easily, found joy in small tasks, and slept with a sense of peace that had eluded him for decades. The daily chores, once tedious and solitary, were now shared and meaningful. The connections he had built with the widows and children gave him energy, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that life, no matter how late it seemed, could offer second chances and profound happiness. One crisp autumn evening, James sat on the porch with all 5 widows nearby, the children playing in the yard. The sun painted the sky with brilliant oranges and reds. and the wind carried a gentle chill across the prairie. James looked at the people around him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "We have built something together," he said quietly. "This is more than a cabin. It's a home, a family, and a place where everyone can grow and thrive." The widows nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting warmth, pride, and hope. In the weeks that followed, the household continued to flourish. James and the widows worked on strengthening the cabin further, adding small touches to make life more comfortable. They built shelves for the kitchen, repaired windows, and created a play area for the children. The garden expanded with seasonal crops, providing more than enough food for everyone. Laughter and conversation filled the cabin at all hours, a constant reminder of the life they had created together. The children grew stronger, wiser, and more confident with each passing day. James encouraged them to explore, learn, and care for the land, and they responded with enthusiasm. They became skilled at riding horses, tending animals, and helping with household chores. More importantly, they learned the value of family, trust, and hard work. The widows watched them with pride, knowing that despite past hardships, their children were thriving in a safe and loving environment. James often thought about how different life had become. He had once believed that his days of significance were over, that solitude would be his only companion. Now he found himself at the center of a lively, loving household, with responsibilities that mattered and connections that gave his life depth and meaning. The widows had not only changed the course of his days, but had transformed his heart, showing him that life could continue to offer love, hope, and fulfillment. One day, James and the widows decided to take a walk together through the fields. They stopped to admire the garden, the fence lines, and the thriving plants. Children ran ahead, chasing one another and laughing in the bright sun. James felt a sense of completion and satisfaction that went beyond words. The land had been restored, the cabin strengthened, and a sense of community had grown in a place that had once been silent and empty. As the sun dipped behind the hills that evening, casting long shadows over the prairie, James felt a profound sense of peace. He looked around at the women and children who had become his family, their faces glowing in the fading light. He realized that his life had been forever changed by their presence. The quiet, solitary years were gone. In their place were laughter, work, love, and a sense of belonging. He understood that life's greatest gifts often came unexpectedly and that second chances were possible at any age. James Walker, the retired cowboy who had once believed he would live and die alone, had found something richer than solitude: connection, purpose, and family. The 5 Apache widows and their children had brought new meaning to his life, and together they had built a home filled with hope, laughter, and strength. The prairie, once silent and empty, now echoed with the sounds of life, and James knew that the days ahead, no matter what challenges they held, would be met together, stronger, happier, and never alone. In that moment, James understood a truth that he had never fully grasped in his long years of wandering and work, that life was never truly over until one stopped believing in the possibility of change. His cabin, the garden, the children, and the widows were living proof that even in the twilight of life, joy, purpose, and love could be found. And as the stars began to appear in the vast western sky, James felt a deep, unshakable gratitude. He was no longer just a retired cowboy. He was part of a family, part of a story that would continue for years to come. And his heart was full.